Welcome to this week's Hangout, where we're going to be discussing something I know that many people find quite awkward, and that is, what would you do if you saw a man punch a woman in the street or harm her in some way? Would you intervene? What about, though, if it was the other way around? If you saw a woman screaming at a man, grabbing his face, possibly hitting him, what would you do? Would the reactions be different? Well, that's precisely what a video which has gone viral this week seeks to find out. This has been put out there by Mankind Initiative, a charity that provides help and support for male victims. The video's had over 4 million views, and it shows very clearly that when a woman is being sort of hit and accosted by a man, people get involved, and when it's the other way around, some people don't get involved at all and are even laughing. So what is your take? You can join us now on Twitter. You can use the hashtag Emma's Hangout. That's on Twitter. Or you can join us at Telly Wonder Women, or tweet me at Emma Barnett. Or you can email us hangout@telegraph.co.uk. Now let me show you a few tweets before I come to my esteemed panel who are going to help us navigate this. A couple of tweets already. James has tweeted in to say, yes, I once did intervene. It degenerated into something ugly, but I'm glad I did it. John Coles has said, anyone assaulted is worthy of intervening. All this violence has to be stopped. Why do we so rarely see a policeman on the street now? Good question indeed. Well, joining me to discuss this is Franki Hackett, Women's Aid spokeswoman. She's here with me now. Chris Green, Chief Executive of the White Ribbon Campaign UK, which is a global campaign to ensure men take more responsibility for reducing the level of violence against women. And Glen Poole, who is the author of Equality for Men. Now, before I go to them, I'm going to say my view, which is that I have been in a situation where I've seen a woman being attacked essentially by what looked like her boyfriend, and I have stepped in. It was in daylight. I went over and I asked her if she was okay and if there was anything I could do. I was quite scared, but I felt there was something I needed to be done in that scenario. However, I have also seen on many a night out women sort of shouting at their boyfriends, screaming at them, hitting them, lashing out at them, and I've never done anything. So, Franki, I'm going to come to you first. As Women's Aid spokesman here, is my response typical, and is it wrong?
Hard to say if it's typical, but I'd say actually in both situations we think you maybe didn't take the ideal course. We don't advise people to intervene because it's really dangerous. You don't know if, as that chap who emailed in said, you don't know if it's going to turn into something that's much more violent for you. You also don't know if the perpetrator is going to go home and take that out on their victim later on. If this is domestic violence, you could be making the situation a lot more dangerous. But doing nothing isn't okay either. So what we advise people to do is, if you're worried about someone's safety or if you're witnessing an assault, call the police. That's what they're there for.
Okay, well, Glen, let me bring you in on this, because obviously there is a difference in the way society sort of perceives violence against men. What's your stance?
Similar to Franki in the sense that personally I'd always try and help, certainly, and I can point to situations that maybe we'll talk about later where I have intervened, when it's been woman-on-woman violence, men and women, a woman on a man, all sorts of different scenarios where I've intervened. But I think we have to send a really strong message to people. That you've got to take your own personal safety, make that your priority. Don't put yourself in dangerous situations. Go and Google "Have a Go Heroes" and find out how many, usually men, have been killed after intervening in a situation. We mustn't sort of make people feel ashamed that they aren't equipped and don't have the resources to actually physically intervene in a situation. And also I think there's something about the great video that Mankind Initiative did, and should be given great credit for getting this conversation sparked, is that in terms of domestic violence, which is kind of where this is coming from, the vast majority of domestic violence takes place behind doors, it's invisible. So that kind of the street violence scenario is an important one. It did demonstrate something about the collective greater tolerance we have about violence against men and violence against women. But we need to do more to address both. And I think people need to think about how can we help without putting ourselves in danger. And so, I think the woman on the video was brilliant because she used her voice, not her body, to intervene, to bring attention to something. She said, "Oi, mate," but then she instantly used the backup of authority. I'll call the police, or someone else will call the police. So she was quite safe in the way she approached that. And clearly, she was safe because there were two actors who weren't going to turn around and punch her. But people have got to weigh up the situation.
Sorry, can I just jump in there? I know we want to come to Chris, but I do want to emphasise it's not safe to jump in even verbally, to intervene even verbally, because you don't know what his response is going to be. People do respond violently to someone trying to stop them do something verbally, and again, he could take it out, or she could take it out, but in the vast majority of cases, he could take it out on the victim later on. So we would say, just don't intervene at all, call the police, that's what they're for, it's not safe. And I don't think it's reasonable to say it is safe to try and intervene verbally.
Okay, well, park that for one moment. Let's bring Chris in on this. Chris, obviously you work with men in this space in quite a different way. What have your experiences had an effect on you and how you view this particular situation?
And what we try and do is get engaged in preventing violence before it ever happened by changing societal culture. Now that's a big call, but and it's a long-term strategy. And in the individual situations, if I was walking down the street and I saw something bad happening on the other side of the street, of course, verbal intervention really useful. One of the things we do in youth clubs and universities around the country is bystander training, which is lots of people say they want to do something, but they're not sure what. And one option is, I want to go and sort it all out, which isn't helpful. And the other one is walk by on the other side, which is absolutely not helpful either. And so by doing training with people, it is helpful. But of course you say, well, it's only going to be a tiny fraction of the people. But if you just start putting the right ideas out there, it's a start.
I'm sorry, what is bystander training? What do you tell people to do so they know if they're watching this?
It's about how to intervene in different ways which aren't either sort of doing nothing or getting, going steaming in. And one of the things I would tend to agree with the woman in the video who intervened by shouting, and with Glen is actually by saying, hey, shout. And I think that's bringing attention to a situation, as well as informing the police, is important, because it's going to take the police a little while to get there.
Okay, so obviously we've got two schools of thought here. One, from Franki from Women's Aid, saying it's not actually safe to do that because you may make it worse, and it may be worse for the person who's the victim in that scenario. And then the other side of it being you should call it out and you should say something. Why don't we talk about some of your personal experiences? Glen, you said there that you've had some experience. Could you tell us one experience or two experiences where you stepped in?
Yeah, a couple. I mean, one was at Victoria train station, very busy, a couple fighting with each other. As in a lot of domestic violence cases, not really clear who was the perpetrator, who was the victim, but clearly something wasn't right. And their children were there crying their eyes out, and people were just walking past. And I couldn't just walk past. So at a safe distance, I spoke in a loud, confident, non-confrontational voice. You two, stop it, look at your children now. And what was interesting in that particular scenario, the man then took that to be that I was on his side and said, yeah, see, yeah, you stop it, you stop it. And I said, no, both of you stop it, you're both responsible. And then he turned on me and was on the point of being physical with me, but I just stood my ground in that situation. I was very scared, but he realised that he couldn't do anything to me. It would be breaking, it would be going too far. And it diffused the situation, other people were then looking. We don't know what happened next. I moved on. I was in a hurry. I don't know if it was the right thing to do or not. It was just like instinct. Another occasion, I often work with male victims of domestic violence, particularly fathers seeking to get out of a relationship which is abusive. And I've been in a scenario several times where I've helped fathers move out of a home where the woman won't vacate the home to allow them to move out safely. And I've stood and I've put myself. That's been more of a risk to me. But I've been there to protect a friend, and I've stood shoulder to shoulder with a man as he moves his stuff out, as a woman hurls abuse at him, hurls abuse at me, throws things at me, and so on and so forth. And that is terrifying, but it's something I've done because it's about actually helping a man who needs help and making sure that a situation doesn't escalate. And that guys have done that, who I've worked with often, they don't want the police to be involved because they're frightened that involving the police will make matters worse. And so that's a really, I wouldn't recommend that people necessarily do that, but I'm just sharing my personal experience of having stood in the face of both women's violence and men's violence and come to no harm in the process. And I believe in both circumstances made a positive contribution that I can look myself in the mirror at the end of the day and said, I think I did the right thing there.
Franki, let's talk about then the idea of people who don't want the police involved, because obviously a lot of people feel like that's going to make it worse, because what you were saying about if you go and intervene when somebody's having a situation like this, you do risk making it worse for the person who is the weaker party of the two. What about the argument for people saying, well, actually, I've called the police to try and help somebody, and what if that's made it worse?
So there are concerns about the police. I think we've got to be upfront, we've got to be honest that the police, I mean, as the most recent HMIC report showed, don't always respond well to domestic violence. The point is that the police are a universal service. They are the only service who have the skills, who have the ability, who have the tools to keep people safe. And when they respond properly to domestic violence, they can be very effective. We're trying to work to give them the tools to do that more effectively. But the point is, as a bystander, with the best will in the world, very few of us are in a position that we really understand the dynamics of domestic violence, and so you just don't know what the effect is going to be. The police at least have the resources to do follow-up work. They can provide the woman with the information that she needs to get support, and you know, they've got those tools at their disposal that they can actually follow it up. And they do have more authority to someone who is being violent. They've got more authority to say there will be consequences if you carry on like this.
So just to talk a bit more about the video, which I just want to stress, by the way, is actually below this video, if you've not watched it, so you can watch it and know what I'm talking about. But at the end, there is a figure quoted which says 40% of domestic violence happens to men. Now, this comes from the Office of National Statistics. However, I think some people seeing that will be very surprised that that figure is that figure. So, Franki, can you just tell us a little bit about contextualising that and how it works with the figures of women?
So that number comes from the British Crime Survey, and the question they ask is, have you ever experienced an incident of physical domestic violence? And that can be, have you ever in your life had a partner slap you? So we do get this statistic that about 40% of the people who say yes to that question are men. The problem is that's not actually domestic violence as it's defined, for example, by the Home Office, which is this pattern of controlling and coercive and repeated behaviour. 89% of the people who experience that are women. So actually, when this video says 40% of people who experience domestic violence are men, it's being quite misleading. It's using statistics in a way that doesn't really capture the reality of domestic violence, which is gendered, which does happen more often to women. And of course, the other thing is that quite a lot of the men who are experiencing domestic violence will be experiencing it from male partners. So it's not the case that this is female violence against men all the time. In a very large proportion, it's male violence against men.
Okay, well, Chris, do you want to say anything on that?
No, I was just going to reiterate the 89% statistic, because that's the existence of the coercive control is what I think a lot of the work should focus on.
Okay, so is there a concern then, I mean, I say this to any of you, is there a concern then that although this video that we're talking about that's prompted this discussion by mankind is obviously important because it shows that, you know, people laugh at men when they're being hit by women, and the reverse is very true, is there a worry that it's a little bit misleading?
Can I jump in here?
Yeah.
So I think this is a really important point. So what you have in the world of tackling all violence is, I've never come across an individual or an organisation who's truly advocating for the end of all violence. You get people who advocate for different groups, and that's perfectly okay. And there's a danger that when you advocate for a particular group, you also become an apologist for people who don't fit your group. And I think both the women's sector and the men's sector are both very guilty of doing that. So there's a real danger that in advocating for stopping male violence against women, which is very important, and any right-minded person would want to do that, that you then start to deny or minimise or diminish the greater violence that actually happens to men and boys. We know that men and boys are actually the main victims of both men's violence and women's violence, and they're actually far less likely to get help and support. And what I found in all the work that I do, not just around violence, but with any issues involving men and boys, is that we have this sort of collective tolerance. We are collectively more tolerant of the harm that happens to men and boys than we are of the harm that happens to women and girls. That doesn't mean to say that we don't need to do more to tackle violence against women, but we need to work that bit harder also to tackle violence against men and boys. This was about street violence. 75% of street violence is against men. Men are more likely to be attacked by someone they know. They're also more likely to be attacked by a stranger. Men are the main victims of violence, and boys, 10 to 15, are the biggest victims of all. 11% of boys aged 10 to 15 experience violence in any year, 5% of girls, 4% of men, 2% of women. In terms of the amount of violence people experience, women are the safest group on average compared to girls, boys and men. And that gets lost in these conversations when we start to just sort of say, well, yeah, you know what, the 40% figure is misleading, but the figures that Frankie just gave are also misleading. No single statistic can actually demonstrate the nuance of gendered violence. No single statistic. What's clear is we are more tolerant of violence against men and boys than women and girls, because men are supposed to be tough and women are gentle and can't hurt men. And that's what stops it to stop, and that's what this great video by the Unplanned Initiative challenges very, very well.
But I think actually that the point is, firstly, I think that the mankind in this particular instance probably undermine their cause by presenting misleading statistics. I think that's the first thing I'd say. And the second thing I'd say is that actually domestic violence is different to other kinds of street violence because it is this pattern of regular, repeated, coercive control that can only exist because of gendered structures in our society, because it happens between the same perpetrator and the same victim over a long period of time. It is different. It just is qualitatively and quantitatively different from other kinds of, for example, street violence. So I think actually we do need to talk about them separately, and you can't get to the specifics of something like domestic violence or even of things like gang violence, of things like street violence, unless you can separate them out and talk about them as different kinds of violence. What we're talking about here is domestic violence. It's important to remember that that's gendered, and it's important to remember that that means that, generally speaking, we are talking about male perpetrators and we're talking about female victims.
Chris, Glenn?
Yes, what I'd like to add to that is actually violence against women is a gendered phenomenon. So when we talk about sexual assault, that's gendered. When we talk about forced marriage and FGM, so it's domestic violence, unless you take it as a broader context, has to be considering violence against women. And of course, street violence is we all condemn and oppose street violence, but it is not likely to be part of coercive control. It doesn't go on and on and on and on.
Okay, well, Glenn, what would you say to that? Because obviously there is this difference that what's so powerful about the video is that it's bringing something out into the open that we don't often associate with seeing, and bringing in all. I get the point where you're saying, we don't want to do down any of the violence against men, but there is obviously, it's a very difficult comparison to make street violence to the level of what goes on in the home.
Yeah, completely. We write men out of the conversation about domestic violence. It's happening in this conversation. Domestic violence gets referred to as something that men do to women, and it's more complex than that. And
so, what does it mean to you, Glenn?
What does it mean to me? Well,
because you're in this conversation, so you can change it.
Yeah, I get that. Do you know, one of the things that most struck me, which really brought this home to me, there's this thing called the public story. It's the public story about domestic violence. There's actually advocates for gay victims that first brought this up. But the public story basically goes that men are problems and women have problems. And you see that really in the conversation about domestic violence. Because of that, it's less a man, a gay man, a gay woman, any victim of female violence is less likely to get help and support, and that really concerns me. And this was really brought home for me in a local consultation where there was a woman who stood up. She stood up and she said, you know what, I'm bisexual, I've been in relationships with men, and I've been in relationships with women. Now, when a man attacked me, people knew what to do. People knew how to respond, kind of like the video showed. People knew how to respond to that because it fitted in with the public story. There was a man attacking a woman. She said, but when I was attacked by my girlfriend, people then didn't know how to respond. They didn't know how to help me, what support to give me. It confused them because it didn't fit in with that story. And I think there's a real danger if the world of violence prevention is dominated by people who only advocate for one kind of violence, that victims don't get help and support. And that's a real worry. And I see that all the time, that men and boys who are victims of violence, be it sexual violence, domestic violence, or physical violence in the street, are less likely to get help and support than women and girls. And that's what we need to change. We need to make sure we help all victims of violence by taking all perpetrators of violence as seriously as each other, irrespective of their gender. And that's what the video shows. We don't take it as seriously when women are the perpetrators. We don't take it as seriously when men are the victims. And that's what we need to challenge.
Okay. Frankie?
Yeah, I just wanted to challenge that perhaps a little bit. So I agree that particular communities are underserved. It's why we work with people like Broken Rainbow to support that LGBT community. It's why we work with Men's Advice Line to support, well, we don't support them, but the Men's Advice Line supports male victims. The point is that actually it's not the case that there are no services for men and there are lots of services for women. We have member services of Women's Aid who have been forced to set up services to support men because otherwise they lose their funding, and those services have never been approached by a single man. Not a single man has come asking them for help, and at the same time the women's services they're running are turning women away. Now that tells me, and we know that the vast majority of women victims are women, that tells me that actually, okay, so in some areas there aren't the right services for the people who need them, but actually that says that we don't necessarily have so much of a problem with meeting women's need and not meeting men's need.
Glenn, surely that is a valid point, because I agree that obviously we need to change, which is why we're having this chat in the first place. We need to change the tone around society so we can also see men as victims and victims who need help. But you can't deny that the sheer scale of this problem, not extending it to street violence, just talking about the coercive side of domestic violence and what happens in the home, is a far greater issue for female victims than men. So consequently, the amount of services and the amount of situations or shelters that have been required are purely, it's a numbers thing, it's just greater. I mean, may I also just remind, this is a statistic I've never really heard anybody other than UKIP's Godfrey Bloom turn down. On average, over the last decade, 2 women have been killed at the hands of a partner every single week.
Muted?
Glenn?
I was muted for a second there. Yeah, and do you know what the statistic is for the number of men are killed and how frequently they are killed? You don't. I'm not saying that we don't need to do more. As long as people are dying at the hands of their partner.
But isn't the reason we don't know the statistic for that because no one's dying at the hands of their partner every single week?
Actually, I can tell you the statistics.
Oh, go. We've got a statistic.
Sorry, it's 17 men a year.
It's 17 men a year.
That was the last statistics when it was 77 women. So the statistic of 2 women a week has also gone down. There was research done by the University of Central Lancashire looking at surveys over 40 years. They found that 50% of victims of domestic violence were men, that 30% of those injured in domestic violence situations were men, and around the world, 25% of victims of domestic violence were men. It varies from year to year. The point is, if you actually start to look at, is an individual victim more or less likely to get help and support? We need to do more for men and for women. I'm advocating for both. What I'm saying is a male victim is less likely. If your services are not attracting male victims, you need to change your service. It's not the men who have an issue. We know that people like Mankind, when there's a storyline on Coronation Street about a male victim of domestic violence, the Mankind Initiative Fund then gets inundated. The key difference is that women's services also advocate for female victims.
Let me bring in Chris to this, because Chris, you're in quite a unique position because you are obviously trying to get men to take more responsibility, at the same time as obviously, I imagine, trying to solve the problem across the board for both genders. Do you think there's an issue with the services that are on offer from places like Women's Aid if they're not getting any men in? Or do you think it's an issue of the way society makes men feel about seeking help?
No, I think the services on offer are quite appropriate. And I mean, I've heard exactly what people have been saying before in terms of demand for there's purported equality of demand for services, but there is no demand out there, and it's become a real problem, especially for some of the service providers. Women's Aid in Scotland and Women's Aid in Wales have really had their finance threatened as a result of this, and I'm not so sure about the situation for England, but I see a lot of the Welsh and Scottish operations. But I'd argue for proportionality, and we've talked about the 90%, 89% of coercive control. And always when I'm on a stall, people will come up to me and say, what about violence against men? And what I say is, I'll talk to you for 10 minutes about violence against men if you talk to me for 90 minutes about violence against women.
Okay, so it's about proportionality. Let me just read out a couple of tweets that we've got in. Mary McLeod, the MP, the Tory MP, has said it's not acceptable for a man to punch a woman or a woman to hit a man. So the equality sort of part there playing out. Some other tweets that we've got in have talked about intervention and if people have intervened. And Jedi for Peace has said, yes, of course I've intervened, but I wouldn't unless 1, he was bigger than me, 2, he had a weapon, 3, she had a weapon, or 4, he was a policeman. Another element. And lots of people saying, I would always intervene no matter who was hitting who, because violence is violence. I mean, there's lots of people saying they would get involved. I mean, when we think about this, and they're also saying, which is contrary to what I've said and contrary to what this video showed, that they wouldn't react differently if they saw a man being roughed up by a woman. Are they lying?
I think also partly for me that video show they are actors, and it's really didn't look for me like that man was under total threat. You know, I mean, it looked like he was being harangued by the woman, and that's the thing of why some of the people were smiling in the background as well. So I think that there is an issue there about the particular incident on the video as well.
Glenn, I've got a tweet here actually from Kathy Dean, which is for you, saying, I can't help thinking Glenn has selective hearing. Domestic violence against men has been clearly included in this conversation so far, and people are saying in and around this conversation more and more. Surely you may think maybe it's getting a bit better, this issue?
Yeah, I think I'm unmuted. Great. We have seen a big improvement over the last 10 years, and where there are good services, then men will access them. I don't think that Women's Aid and people like that should be providing services for men. I think we need people who are advocates for men, passionate about helping men, specialising in that, so that we can get the proportionality right. My concern is that because of our collective tolerance of violence against men, because we don't recognise that men are the main victims of both men's violence and women's violence, individual men are less likely to get help and support. And I think if this video does anything to get us thinking about that and make sure all victims of violence, irrespective of gender, get help, then it's a good thing.
Can I just agree with Glenn there, actually, that male victims of domestic violence do need specific specialist services. They've got very particular needs. And, you know, if we can get a situation where there are services for the men that need them that are gender specific, that would be ideal. But the problem is, at the moment, we're looking at a situation where there's very limited money and it is only being given to services that do both. And unfortunately, that means that a lot of local authorities are asking for services that run exactly the same amount and exactly the same type of services for men and women. And that doesn't serve men or women, but it particularly hurts the larger number of female victims.
And so, Franki, just give me an idea. Is it doing better? You know, is the work of Chris, for instance, of the White Ribbon campaign, and the sort of greater awareness of this being an issue, whether it's through TV soaps or videos like this, are we seeing the levels of domestic violence decrease in this country? And sort of a second part to that, the cuts that you've seen as part of this current government policy, is that in line with that?
No. So certainly on the second part, no. It's very difficult to get a measure on how much domestic violence there is. I think we all know about the problems with police reporting statistics. Okay. The only objective measure we have, unfortunately, is the number of people killed. And yeah, okay, it went down last year, but if you look at the 5-year average, if you look at the 10-year averages, we're seeing 2 women a week killed, and we've seen that for the past few decades. Unfortunately, that's not really budging. So it's really hard to say that the levels of domestic violence are getting better in any way. So the cuts we're seeing aren't responding to a decrease in need. They are unfortunately just piling on top of a situation where there are a large number of people, the majority of them women, who really, really need support and who aren't getting it funded.
Okay, and Chris, have you seen any changes lately, just to sort of end on, you know, an idea of where we're going with this?
I think we see some encouraging developments about awareness raising, which is good, because that'll only lead to an increase in reporting. But you know what that's going to mean? It's going to be a massive increase in search for services. And so we need to increase funding for services. And I'm sure we'll all agree that actually we need to fight the cuts and stop the cuts in services when there's such an epidemic of violence out there.
All right, well, let's leave it there.
Violence against women.
Let's leave it there at the moment, because I'm sure we're going to continue online. You can keep going with this using the hashtag Emma's Hangout. Would you intervene, now you've heard this, if you saw a man get physical with a woman in the street, and vice versa. If you saw a woman get physical with a man, tweet us using the hashtag Emma's Hangout. You can get get in touch with us at Telly Wonder Women or via my account at Emma Barnett. That leaves me just to say thank you very, very much to all of my participants this lunchtime hangout. Franki Hackett from Women's Aid, Chris Green from the White Ribbon Campaign UK, and Glen Poole, author of Equality for Men. Thank you very much to you all. And you can join us next Wednesday at 1 p.m. to hang out with us again.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.